Dune Part 2 is finally here. It's the best movie of the year easily, and the best movie I've seen in quite some time. And I would go as far as to say that Dune Part 2 might actually be the best sequel of all time, because it builds on the story of Dune Part 1, it adds new story elements that help flesh out this world and its characters, and it's flat out just a really well put together movie, with great directing, acting, editing, and cinematography. And I'm gonna do my best to avoid spoilers in this review. Paul's story in Part 2 is a great follow-up to his arc in Part 1. In the first movie, he went through this arc of growing up, turning from this young boy to the leader of his family and house. Part 1 also teased us with Paul being the prophesized Lisan al-Gaib, and Part 2 expands on these ideas by showing Paul's rise to power as Lisan al-Gaib. It's interesting to see Paul learn the Fremen ways, grow closer to the people, and eventually become this religious figure. I found myself very invested in this story, and it's really intriguing to see how the different characters in Paul's life react to him leading the Fremen into this war. And the film tells us this prophecy in a very clever way. There's never a big exposition scene where a character sits us down and is like, alright, this is the prophecy, this is all the details you need to know. That never happens. We get pieces scattered throughout the whole movie, and we have to put the whole prophecy together ourselves. And I like that the movie doesn't have a lot of hand-holding. Also, I found it very funny that Stilgar was Paul's personal cheerleader throughout the film. Paul could do literally anything and Stilgar would be like, yes, that's our guy. It was really funny. And Part 2 has a bit more laughs than the first movie, which I appreciated. Jessica's story is also expanded on. She doesn't have as big of a role in this movie as she did in the first one, but her story is more interesting this time around. She's given a position of power early on, and we get to see how she manipulates people and controls certain events that happen in the movie. And with how the story turns out, you could potentially interpret her as a villain. The movie also has a bunch of brand new storylines, most notably the romance between Paul and Chani. The first half of the film is almost entirely dedicated to these two characters forming this relationship. It's very well written, and having that hour and a half of setup really pays off in the end, as we see where this relationship goes and what happens to these two characters. And if you've seen this movie, you know what happens, and Part 2 also greatly expands on the different factions of this universe. The Harkonnens have a lot more screen time this time around. There's an interesting dynamic where Rabban and Feyd-Rautha are both trying to win Baron Vladimir's favor by conquering Arrakis, but it's made clear that the Baron doesn't actually care for either of them and still only serves his own means. So there's an interesting dynamic there between the main villains. But I have to mention, Feyd-Rautha is amazing. I do think people might have oversold him a bit. People are saying he's one of the best villains of all time, or that he's comparable to Darth Vader or Voldemort. I don't think he's quite on that level, just because he doesn't have enough screen time, but he's still a really cool, sinister, calculated villain who feels like a genuine threat. And the fight between him and Paul in this film is spectacular. It's gritty, intense, and brutal. I loved everything about that duel. May thy knife chip and shatter. Ooh. We meet the Emperor and the Princess in this movie, and for the most part, they're sort of just there. They're important for Paul's ascendancy to power, but as characters, they themselves aren't all that memorable. Even though there is an interesting idea where this guy is the Emperor, but he's clearly not in charge of anything, and I can't really say much more without dipping into spoilers. But even beyond story elements, this movie is a masterwork in every aspect. In my opinion, Dune Part 2 cements Denis Villeneuve as the best director working today. This guy just does not miss, and this movie is maybe his finest work. He crafted so many sequences that are visually stunning and exciting and intense. What comes to mind are sequences like Paul riding the worm, or Feyd-Rautha's black and white introduction, or one of the many grand and epic action sequences in the film. Villeneuve recently said that he believes visual storytelling is more important than dialogue, and I think he proved that to be true. Also, Greg Fraser is once again the cinematographer for this movie, and like with Part 1, he made an absolutely beautiful looking film. A lot of people's complaint with Dune Part 1 is that it was kind of slow and boring. I don't necessarily agree with that. It is a slow burn, but I thought the story and the visuals kept it very entertaining. But Dune Part 2 is not a slow burn. The pacing is a lot quicker than in Part 1. There is a lot of material they jam into 2 hours and 46 minutes. So it wastes no time introducing us to new characters, developing stories, and showing us all the cool explosions and fight scenes. But that's not to say Dune Part 2 is rushed. I think it's pretty well paced throughout the entire runtime, so you shouldn't need Subway Surfers playing on another screen or whatever Gen Z is doing nowadays. I don't know. Dune Part 2 also has some incredible performances. I mean, look at this cast. This is one of the best cast of actors ever assembled for a movie. Josh Brolin gives a surprisingly emotional performance as Gurney Halleck, and he plays a little ditty on his guitar, which I quite enjoyed. Dave Bautista is once again good as Raban. I did not expect that character to be such a pathetic loser, but it works pretty well. Also, this meme was going around last week, and it sums up both of these characters pretty well. I already mentioned Javier Bardem is really funny as Stilgar, but he also delivers the more emotional scenes. We get a lot of Stilgar in this movie, and he's really fun to watch. I'm not going to go in depth with the rest of the cast, but Rebecca Ferguson, Florence Pugh, Christopher Walken, Stellan Skarsgård, Lea Seydoux, and Anya Taylor-Joy, who plays a surprise character that I will not spoil, all do a really good job as their respective characters. But the standouts really are Austin Butler, Zendaya, and especially Timothée Chalamet. I always liked Timothée Chalamet as an actor, but he has never commanded the screen quite like he did in this film. There's something that happens to Paul in the later half of this movie that changes the whole tone of the story and Timothy's performance. From then on, he steals every scene he's in, and he fully becomes the character of Muad'Dib. It's a seriously impressive lead performance. Austin Butler is fantastic as Fade Rotha. Just like with Elvis, he completely transforms into this character, and the voice he uses is insane.
May thy knife chip and shatter.
The biggest surprise for me was Zendaya. In my head, I know she's a really talented actor, but for some reason, the first thing that comes to my mind when I think about her work is Shake It Up. Does anyone else remember Shake It Up? No? Just me? Okay. But yeah, she's really great in this. She makes Chani a very likable character, and it's really easy to feel for her and all the different things she goes through. In a lot of ways, she's the heart of the movie. So at this point, it's pretty obvious that Dune Messiah is gonna happen, and I love how this movie sets up for the final installment. As I mentioned in my Dune Part 1 video, I believe Dune will be one of the best trilogies of all time. And now that I've seen Part 2, I'm more certain than ever. As of right now, I can't truly say if Dune Part 2 is the best sequel ever made, but it's certainly in the conversation with movies like Empire Strikes Back, or Godfather 2, or Aliens, or Paddington 2. And the cultural impact of this movie is insane. It's doing really well at the box office. People have been talking about it for weeks, and they will continue talking about it. I see so many jokes about that stupid popcorn bucket. And I saw this movie on a Monday at 10:15 a.m. and the theater was mostly full. I have never seen that before. There was a line of people outside the movie theater before it even opened. Dune Part 2 has taken a huge hold on popular culture, and I'm here for it. But if you haven't, you should check out my video explaining why Dune will be the next great trilogy. Or if you're all duned out, you can check out my review of Godzilla -1 minus color. Yeah, these are two good videos about two good movies. You should check them out. Just click on one of them, whichever one floats your boat. You'll have a good time, I promise.